Hi again, here we are to talk about React Native and JavaScript. And in our last example, we got our timer kind of running and formatting the time. And what I'd like to do now is kind of set our timer up so it keeps track of time a little more accurately. And here's our code here, right? And so we've got our format time, and format time is assuming that the time coming into this method is in milliseconds. And what I'm assuming is that the time here on state, this value is kept in milliseconds, and it represents the time, the number of milliseconds since you press the button to run. Okay, right? So what we're going to do is up here in the constructor, I'm going to add one more class property, and this doesn't need to be on state because changing this or editing it, or working with it doesn't affect the view of the component. It's not going to determine how the component renders, right? So I'm going to call this last update time, and we'll just set it to 0. Okay? So this will be the time that, or the number of the milliseconds that represents when our last update was. Okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to go down to start timer, right? So we call this when we start the timer. And what we're going to do is we're going to set this dot last update time equal to Date.now. So this returns the number of milliseconds that represents the current time. So the time is actually kept track of in JavaScript as milliseconds, and that represents the time, date, and year. Okay, so it's the number of milliseconds since the Unix epoch, which is like 1970, right? January 1st, 1970. So this gives us the number of milliseconds since then, and that's our last update, right? And then what we're going to do is we're going to go down here or we're going to go up a little ways and find update. And what we'd like to do is we'd like to say, hey, let's get a constant. Let's say now equals Date.now. Okay? So you can see if we started the timer and then some time passed and we got a call to update, then update's going to check now, and we're going to get the time in milliseconds that's a little bit in the future, right? So like if we had our timer updates where every, let's say, I'm going to change this on, set interval down here. I'm going to change this from 10 to like 500. So apparently, like if we started the last update time now, and imagine this was like, 0, right? Then when we get an update 500 milliseconds later, then now should be 500, right? Because we had 0 down here, right? Okay. So then what we'll do is we'll say, we'll get the difference, like how much time has changed, right? So we'll say constant delta, so this will be delta time, right? So the difference in time is equal to now minus this last update time. So if now is 500 and our last update was at 0, then delta should be 500. Right? Now we could just add 500 because we know the intervals go off at every 500 milliseconds, but actually these are not correct, right? These are like sort of 500. Sometimes they're a little longer. Sometimes they're like 642, or they're probably never under 500, but they're never going to be exactly 500. And if they are, probably something's weird because it took our computer less than a millisecond to do everything that it had to do, right? So these are never going to be perfect, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to get the perfect difference up here, okay? And then what we'll do is we'll say this dot last update time equals now, right? So that's kind of what we did here, right? So from the last update, we'll set the last update time to the current time when we ran update. And then over here, when we set the time on state, right, when we're saying, hey, this dot set state time, right, we're going to look at this state dot time and we'll say plus equals, and we'll add the delta time here. Okay, so time now is just going to be the total running time since you started the timer, right? Okay, we could add a reset button too to reset it to 0. So right now it'll just be like sort of a cumulative count, right? Let's see if I got that right, and then we'll give it a test, right? So let's make sure. So we're going to get the current time. We're going to subtract the last update time. When we start the timer, we got to make sure that our last update time was the time when you started, and then we'll set the milliseconds here to something. This could be 1,000. It's probably best for us to keep this under 1 second, right? So 500 is probably okay. You could do a smaller number. You know, imagine this being kind of a value here. The smaller number we get, the more granular it is, probably the more accurate the timer is, but the more updates that our component needs to run, so less efficient our software is, right? So we just want to find a number here that kind of balances that. Maybe 500, I'm guessing, might work well. And then if we go down to our formatter, you know, remember under render, we're passing in this state.time. So we're passing time into the formatter, and so that should be the number of milliseconds since we started running, right? And if we divide by 1,000, if we divide the milliseconds by 1,000, then we get the number of seconds, right? Let's give it a try. So we'll go back here and we'll refresh our app, and there's 1, 2, 3, right? So those are about a second each, right? And then if I pause, it should pause. And then we already saw that this counts to 60 and then rolls over to 1 second. So we won't wait a minute here for this to count up, but that should be pretty accurate, right? So anyway, that was a quick run through of how to create, a stateful component. And again, just to review, state represents something in the component where, if that value for the component might change during the life of the component, then the component will update or draw itself based on the state. Props kind of, are like a simple version of state. Props let you pass values in to tell the component how to configure itself, but the props don't really change, right? See, state is something that the component keeps track of itself, and state can update. So in our case, as the time updates, then the value on state here for time is updated, and the component redraws itself, right? It changes its display every time the time is updated. And then the same is true for the pause button. So the on property here, when we tap the pause and run button, it changes the on value, right? And when that changes, then the button changes, right? So that's in a nutshell kind of how state works, right? So anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope that is useful to you, and good luck with your React projects.